Welcome, and thank you for joining me for this long journey into the past. Tonight, or today, depending on when you are listening, we are going to step quietly into the world of medieval farmers. Together, we will explore how ordinary families survived the most difficult season of the year, the starving winter. This is not a story of knights, castles, or kings, but of the people who lived close to the earth, who rose and rested by the sun, and who relied on their animals, their neighbors, and their wits to see another spring. As you listen, I invite you to imagine a world without electricity, without supermarkets, without central heating. The days grow short, the nights grow long. The fields that once offered wheat and barley now lie frozen and silent. The trees are bare, the rivers icy, and the winds sharp against the skin. This was winter for the medieval farmer, and it was not simply a season to endure. It was often a matter of survival. Food was scarce. The harvest of autumn had to be stretched across months of cold when nothing new could grow. Every mistake in planning, every spoiled sack of grain, every weak cow could mean hunger or worse. Families sat together in cottages of wood and thatch, with smoke curling from small hearth fires, hoping their stores would last until spring returned. But this is not only a tale of hardship. It is also a story of strength, creativity, and community. For despite the difficulties, medieval farmers found ways to endure. They learned how to preserve food, how to keep warm with the simplest resources, and how to share with neighbors when times grew desperate. They turned long nights into opportunities for storytelling and teaching, passing down knowledge that would help their children survive winters of their own. This video is not a quick dive into facts. Instead, it is designed to be slow and steady, like the rhythm of life in a farming village centuries ago. We will move carefully through the year, arriving at winter's doorstep and stepping inside the homes of those who lived through it. We will sit by their fires, listen to the creak of their tools, taste their simple meals, and understand the choices they had to make. My purpose here is not only to teach, but to give you space to relax. Let the history flow like a calm stream. If you drift into thought, or even into sleep, that is perfectly fine. The story will wait for you, carrying you gently through the struggles and small victories of people who lived long before us. So settle in. Maybe dim the lights, take a deep breath, and imagine the sound of snow against the wooden shutters of a medieval cottage. Outside, the wind howls across empty fields. Inside, a small family gathers around the fire, holding on to warmth, to food, and to hope. This is where our journey begins, in the cold heart of winter, with farmers who had to endure, and who found ways, year after year, to survive. The medieval year and the coming of winter. To understand how medieval farmers survived the starving winters, we must first step back and look at the rhythm of their year. Life in the Middle Ages was guided not by clocks or calendars as we know them today, but by the turning of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, and the growth and harvest of crops. Each season had its work, and each season carried the weight of preparation for the one that followed. For the farmer, spring meant new beginnings. As the snow melted and the ground softened, families took to the fields with plows pulled by oxen, or horses if they were lucky. They sowed seeds of wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were the grains that would become bread, ale, and porridge tea, staples of their diet. The work was heavy, and much depended on weather they could not control. Too much rain, and the seeds might rot. Too little, and they might never sprout. Spring was a season of both hope and risk. Summer was a time of constant labor. Fields had to be weeded, animals tended, and meadows cut for hay. Hay was especially important, for it fed the cows, sheep, and goats during the barren months when grass would no longer grow. Without enough hay, livestock would weaken or die, and with them, the milk, wool, and meat families depended on. Every hour of daylight was precious, and farmers often rose before dawn and worked until the sun dipped low. Then came autumn, the most critical season of all. This was the time of harvest, when the year's survival was measured by what could be brought in from the fields. Wheat and rye were cut, threshed, and stored. Vegetables were pulled from the soil and taken to cool cellars. Fruits like apples and pears were dried or pressed into cider. Families gathered nuts, berries, and herbs to add to their store. It was a season of abundance, but also of anxiety. For everyone knew that winter was waiting. Winter was not just another season, it was a test. Unlike spring, summer, and autumn, when food could be gathered fresh from the fields, winter demanded foresight. Every loaf of bread eaten in January had been baked from grain stored since autumn. Every piece of meat smoked in summer was now carefully rationed. Farmers knew that one poor harvest could mean months of hunger, and that is why autumn was filled with both relief and fear. The coming of winter also changed the rhythm of daily life. The sun set early, often before many tasks could be finished. The air grew colder, and cottages with poor insulation could feel more like shelters than homes. People layered clothing, wrapped themselves in wool, and huddled near the fire. Animals were brought into barns or even into parts of cottages, their body heat adding to the warmth of the household. For medieval farmers, the approach of winter was not just physical, it was also deeply emotional. They knew the risks that came with cold months. Hunger, illness, and isolation were constant threats. A family might whisper prayers for health, for strength, and for enough food to see them through. Communities gathered for late autumn festivals, not only to celebrate the harvest, but to remind one another that they were not alone in facing the dark months. It is important to remember that the medieval year was not built around comfort or convenience. It was built around survival. The success of spring sowing, the toil of summer, and the abundance of autumn were all tied together in the long, careful plan to endure winter. If any step failed, the consequences would echo through the cold season, and so, as the last leaves fell from the trees and frost began to bite at the ground, the medieval farmer braced for what lay ahead. Food was stored, firewood was stacked, hay was piled high in barns. Families tucked themselves into cottages of wood and stone, listening to the wind outside and holding tight, to the hope that their preparations would be enough. This was the rhythm of the medieval era, circle that returned again and again, demanding work, faith, and endurance. And now, with the fields empty and the nights long, we follow these farmers into winter itself, to see how they managed to survive the season that tested them most. Food preservation for winter survival. When we think about winter survival in the medieval world, food was always at the heart of it. A farmer's family could endure cold weather with warm clothes and a good fire, but without food, no one could survive. For this reason, food preservation was perhaps the most important task of the year. The harvest of autumn had to last through months of scarcity, and so people developed many careful ways to store, stretch, and protect what they had. Grain, the foundation of survival. Grain was the backbone of the medieval diet. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were grown in the fields and harvested in autumn. These grains became bread, porridge, and aled the foods that filled stomachs when little else was available. But grain was also fragile. Rats, damp, and mold could destroy months of labor if storage was careless. Farmers stored grain in wooden chests, clay pots, or even underground pits lined with straw. The goal was to keep the harvest dry, cool, and safe from pests. Sometimes grain was kept in communal barns, where the whole village had an interest in keeping it secure. Families often guarded their stores carefully, measuring out what they could eat and resisting the temptation to consume too much too soon. A single loaf of bread in January was not just food. It was a piece of planning from the autumn before, a reminder that survival depended on foresight. Vegetables from field to cellar grains alone could not keep a family healthy. Vegetables provided variety and vital nutrients, but most vegetables did not last long once pulled from the soil. To solve this, medieval farmers relied on root cellars. These were cool, dark storage pits or small underground rooms where the earth's natural chill acted like a refrigerator. Turnips, beets, onions, carrots, and parsnips were stored in these cellars, often packed with sand or straw to keep them from rotting. Cabbages were sometimes hung upside down, their outer leaves drying while the inner heart remained edible for months. Beans and peas were dried and stored in sacks, ready to be boiled into thick soups, though fresh greens were rare in winter. Families did their best to stretch these foods, sometimes adding handfuls of dried herbs to improve the flavor of stews and broths. Meat smoking, salting, and drying meat was valuable but hard to preserve. Fresh meat spoiled quickly in winter's cold, too warm shifts, so preservation methods were essential. Salting. Large chunks of pork or beef were packed in barrels of salt. The salt drew out moisture, slowing decay and keeping the meat safe for weeks or months. Smoking. Farmers built small smokehouses where strips of meat could hang above slow-burning fires. The smoke dried the meat and gave it a flavor that many found comforting in the long cold months. Drying in some regions. Thin cuts of meat or fish were dried in the open air or over gentle heat, making them tough but long-lasting pigs. In particular, were slaughtered in late autumn, just as winter began. This meant farmers could save on feeding animals through the cold months, while also filling their stores with salted pork, sausages, and lard for cooking, dairy, butter, and cheese. Milk itself did not keep long, but dairy farmers had clever ways of preserving its value. Butter was churned and stored in cool places. Salted butter lasted even longer. Cheese became one of the most reliable preserved foods. Soft cheeses spoiled quickly, but hard cheeses could last through the winter. These cheeses not only fed families, but also provided important fats and proteins. In monasteries, cheesemaking became an art, and even small villagers learned how to make simple cheeses that could sustain them when other foods grew scarce. Drinks, ale, beer, and cider. Clean drinking water was not always easy to find in winter, especially when wells froze or streams turned foul. For this reason, many medieval families brewed their own ale or beer. These drinks were weak compared to modern versions, but they were safe, nourishing, and warming. Ale was made from barley and cider from apples. Both could be stored for weeks or months, offering a dependable drink that also carried calories. Even children often drank watered ale instead of plain. Water, fruits, nuts, and honey not. All winter foods were heavy or plain. Families tried to keep small stores of sweetness and variety. Apples and pears were dried or kept in cool lofts. Nuts like hazelnuts, chestnuts, and walnuts were gathered in autumn and stored in sacks. Honey was treasured not only as a sweetener but also as medicine. These foods offered bursts of energy and were sometimes saved for feast days. When a family wished to mark a holiday with something special, stretching food in hard times, even with good preservation, food supplies were not always enough. To stretch what they had, families often made thin soups with bread or boiled grains into porridge. Bones left from salted meat were simmered again and again, each pot of broth thinner than the last. Bread itself could be stretched by mixing in barley, oats, or even ground acorns when wheat was scarce. These loaves were heavy and coarse, but they filled the stomach. The risk of spoilage, despite all these methods, no family could be sure their food would last. A wet autumn might spoil grain. A poorly sealed barrel could ruin meat. Rats could chew through sacks of peas. Spoilage was a constant fear, and every mouthful in midwinter was eaten with a quiet hope that the next meal would still be there. Community and storage food preservation was not always a private matter. In some villages, barns and cellars were shared. This encouraged cooperation, but also meant that one family's hunger might become the whole village's problem. Churches and monasteries often kept stores of food as well, sometimes distributing them in times of need. The emotional weight of preserving food for us today. Storing food means stacking shelves in a pantry or filling a freezer. For the medieval farmer, it meant survival itself. Preserving food was not just a chore, it was a ritual of safety. Every salted piece of pork, every bag of beans, every dried apple was a small shield against the deadly cold months. It was not just food that was stored, it was hope. Hope that spring would come before the cellar emptied. Hope that children would grow strong enough to help in the next year's fields. Hope that families could survive together, even when the world outside their doors was frozen and bare. Food was the core of survival, but it was not the only challenge. Farmers also needed to keep warm. A cottage filled with grain was no comfort if frost bit at every corner and firewood ran out. In the next section, we step into those small, smoky homes to see how medieval families fought the cold. Heating and warmth in the medieval home food kept people alive through the starving winter, but warmth gave them the strength to endure it. The cold was not only uncomfortably, was dangerous. Frostbite, sickness, and weakness could all follow. If a family failed to keep the chill at bay, unlike today, there were no thick glass windows, no central heating, and no electric blankets. Warmth had to be created by hand and preserved with care. The peasant cottage, for most farming families, the home was a simple wooden or stone cottage, roofed with thatch or wooden shingles. The walls were often thin, with gaps that let in drafts. Windows, if there were any, were small and sometimes covered with oiled cloth instead of glass. Inside, the main source of heat was a single hearth, usually set in the middle of the room. A fire burned there, fueled by wood, peat, or even dried animal dung when wood was scarce. Smoke drifted upward and out through a hole in the roof, though often the smoke filled the room first, leaving walls blackened and lungs irritated. The hearth gave both heat and light, and families gathered close to it during the long winter nights. Fuel for the fire. One of the most important autumn tasks was gathering enough fuel. In wood-rich regions, peasants collected branches, logs, and twigs. Where trees were few, people cut blocks of peat from bogs, dried them, and stacked them like bricks. In poorer homes, dried straw, reeds, or dung were burned. Though these fuels gave little warmth and burned quickly, Every piece of fuel was precious. A roaring fire was a luxury. Most families tried to keep the hearth smoldering gently, feeding it just enough to stay alive through the night. If the fire went out, starting it again in the freezing morning was a slow and unpleasant task. Clothing and layers fire alone was not enough to keep out the cold. People relied on layers of clothing, made mostly from wool and linen. Wool was the best protection. It trapped heat, resisted water, and was sturdy enough to last for years. Linen, though lighter, provided an extra layer beneath. Peasants wrapped themselves in cloaks, shawls, and caps. Gloves and stockings, often knitted or sewn from wool, kept fingers and toes from freezing. At night, families piled on every blanket, cloak, and scrap of cloth they owned. Sleeping for warmth night was the hardest time, when the fire burned low and the cold pressed in from all sides. Families often shared beds, lying close together under coarse woolen blankets. Straw mattresses gave some insulation from the frozen earth floor. Children sometimes slept in lofts above the main room, where rising heat from the hearth gave them extra warmth. In many cottages, animals were also brought inside during winter. A cow or goat in the corner of the room gave more than milk, it gave body heat. Chickens, pigs, and even sheep might spend the coldest nights under the same roof as their owners. The smell was strong, but the warmth could mean the difference. Between life and death, manor houses and castles, not all homes were alike. Lords and wealthy families lived in stone manors or castles with larger fireplaces, sometimes in every room. Yet even these buildings were drafty, with cold stone walls and high ceilings. Tapestries and heavy curtains were hung to block the chill. Servants carried braziers, small portable fires from room to room. Even with these advantages, people still slept under heavy furs and cloaks. Winter cold spared no one. Keeping out, the drafts farmers did what they could to make their homes tighter against the weather. Cracks in walls were stuffed with moss, straw, or rags. Doors were covered with heavy cloth or wood planks. Floors were sometimes layered with rushes or straw, which not only insulated but also absorbed dirt and moisture. These measures did not stop the cold, but they made it bearable. Daily life around the hearth was the heart of the home. Families cooked their meals over the fire, sat by it to work with their hands, and gathered around it to tell stories. In the short daylight hours, chores kept people outside, but once darkness fell, the fire drew everyone together. The warmth of the hearth was more than physical. It gave a sense of safety, of life continuing in the face of winter's challenges. A glowing ember was a quiet comfort, a small promise that spring would come again. The fragility of warmth, yet warmth was always fragile. A shortage of firewood, a bitter wind, or a collapsed roof could turn a home into an icy prison. Poorer families often struggled most. Without enough clothing or fuel, they relied on neighbors or charity, or endured cold that made every breath an effort. Sickness followed the cold. Coughs and fevers spread easily in cramped, smoky cottages. Children and the elderly were most at risk, and many winters left behind memories of loss. Enduring together despite these dangers, medieval farmers survived. They learned to make the most of what they had. They layered, they shared, they adapted. A warm corner of a cottage, a well-tended fire, and the closeness of family gave them strength through the longest nights in winter. Warmth was not just about firewood or wool, it was about resilience. The ability to keep going, to make do, to endure. Food and warmth were the two pillars of survival. But there was another force just as important: the power of community. In the next section, we will see how medieval farmers leaned on their neighbors, their villagers, and even the charity of monasteries to survive the starving winters together. The role of community and sharing when winter pressed hardest on the medieval countryside. No family could stand entirely alone. Food stores grew thin, fires burned low, and spirits sank beneath the weight of long nights. What often made the difference between survival and despair was the strength of community. Villagers, neighbors, and even monasteries formed networks of support that helped farmers endure the starving winters together. The village as a family. Medieval farming villages were a typical settlement might have only a few dozen households, often bound together by shared land, shared labor, and shared hardships. Everyone knew one another, and everyone watched over one another. A family's misfortune could ripple across the entire community. When food was stored in autumn, it was not only for the household, but for the village's security. Some communities maintained shared barns or grain stores. If one family lost its crop to damp or rats, neighbors sometimes stepped in with help, knowing that next year the roles might be reversed. In this way, survival was treated as a collective effort, communal work and winter chores. Even in the dead of winter, there was work to do. Snow had to be cleared, water carried from wells, and animals tended in barns. These tasks often became shared duties. A stronger household might lend a hand to an elderly neighbor, or children might run errands between cottages. In harsh times, cooperation reduced the burden on individuals at times of plenty. Villagers gathered for feasts in late autumn or around midwinter festivals. These gatherings were not just for celebration. They reminded everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would carry them through the season of scarcity. Hospitality and neighborly bonds. Hospitality was considered both a duty and a virtue. Offering a meal, a seat by the fire, or a warm drink to a neighbor in need was not unusual. Farmers who slaughtered animals in autumn often shared portions of meat with neighbors, expecting that the kindness would be returned one day. Winter sharpened the value of these bonds. A loaf of bread shared in January, or a pile of firewood given freely could mean survival for a family on the edge. The memory of these acts wove trust between households, strengthening the fabric of the community. Monasteries and charity beyond the village. Monasteries played an important role in survival. Monks managed large farms and kept stores of grain, cheese, and ale. During harsh winters, they were expected to provide charity to the poor, the hungry, and travelers caught in the cold. For many peasants, monasteries were places of last resort, where a small portion of bread or a bowl of soup might prevent starvation. The giving of food was also seen as a spiritual act, a way for the wealthy in the church to gain favor in heaven. Though not every monastery was generous, many became lifelines in years of deep famine. Feasts and the strength of shared meals, even in times of scarcity. Villagers found ways to gather around shared meals. A midwinter feast, often tied to Christmas, or Candlemas provided relief from the monotony of thin porridge and dry bread. Families contributed what they could: some grain, some dried fruit, perhaps a piece of salted meat, and together they created meals larger than any household could manage alone. These feasts were not only about food. They lifted spirits, strengthened bonds, and reminded people that joy could still be found, even when days were short and fields lay frozen. The moral weight of sharing in the medieval world. Sharing was not simply kindness. It was often seen as an obligation, shaped by both community expectations and religious belief. To hoard while neighbors suffered was to risk shame, resentment, and even divine judgment. To share, even when one had little, was to show faith, compassion, and loyalty, of course. Not all winters saw generosity. Hunger sometimes drove families to hide their supplies, to refuse help, or even to steal. But in many cases, the bonds of community held strong, offering protection where individuals alone might have failed. Stories and songs in the dark beyond food and firewood. People also shared time and company. Winter nights were long and silent, without light or warmth. To fill the emptiness, villagers gathered to tell stories, sing songs, and pass down traditions. These gatherings gave comfort and reminded everyone that life continued beyond the cold. Elders told tales of past winters, of how ancestors endured famine or hardship. These stories were not only entertainments, they were lessons in resilience, reminders that survival was possible. Enduring together the starving winters were tests of endurance, but they were rarely endured alone. Villagers survived through bonds of sharing, through kindness between neighbors, and through the broader support of monasteries and community traditions. It is often said that survival in the medieval world was not just about food or fire, it was about belonging. To be part of a community was to have a chance. To be alone was to face the cold with little hope. As we step further into winter life, we see that survival was not only about storage, fire, and neighbors. It was also about the rhythm of daily life inside the home chores, crafts, small routines, and the quiet endurance of long nights. In the next section, we enter the cottage itself, to see how families filled their winter days when the fields lay empty and the land slept beneath the snow. When the fields lay frozen and the snow rested heavy on the rooftops, medieval farmers turned inward. The frantic pace of spring planting and autumn harvest slowed, but life did not stop. Winter was not a season of idleness. It was a season of smaller labors, quiet endurance, and the daily effort to stretch limited supplies until the warmth of spring returned. Morning in a winter cottage, a winter day often began before sunrise, when the cottage was still dark and the embers of the fire had burned low. The first task was to coax the fire back to life. A child or parent stirred the ashes, added straw and kindling, and carefully placed logs to spark new flames. Without fire, the home grew icy, and meals could not be prepared. Breakfast was simple: a slice of coarse bread, sometimes dipped in thin ale or warmed with broth. On good days, a bit of cheese or porridge might be added. Meals were small and practical, meant only to keep strength for the day's work. Caring for animals after eating. Attention turned to the animals. Even in winter, cows needed milking, pigs needed feeding, and chickens needed protection from the cold. Many animals were kept in barns or even inside the cottage itself, where their body heat helped warm the family. Feeding them was no easy task. Hay, gathered in summer, was rationed carefully. Water was fetched from wells or streams, often broken open with axes when ice covered the surface. These chores were heavy in cold weather, but they were vital. Animals provided milk, eggs, wool, and manure, and losing them in winter could be disastrous. Fetching water and fuel water was a constant need. Wells had to be visited daily, and in snowstorms the path might be buried, making each trip a struggle. Buckets of icy water were carried back to the cottage for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Fuel was equally precious. Children gathered fallen branches, while adults split wood or fetched peat blocks from storage. Every armful mattered. Families knew exactly how many logs or peat bricks remained, and every fire had to be measured against the length of winter still to come. Indoor work and crafts. Much of winter life happened indoors. With fields sleeping under snow, families turned to crafts and repairs, spinning and weaving. Women and older children spun wool or flax into thread, later woven into cloth. This work filled long hours by the fire and ensured clothing and blankets for the future. Mending tools. Farmers repaired plows, carts, and harnesses. Wooden handles were replaced, iron parts sharpened, and ropes twisted from hemp or flax. Basket weaving and carving. Everyday items like baskets, spoons, and bowls were crafted during winter, when hands needed work and fields demanded little. These tasks were not only practical, they gave rhythm to the long dark hours, turning silence into productivity. Children were never idle. They fetched water, gathered kindling, fed chickens, and helped spin or card wool. In winter, they also had time to learn skills from their parents, how to weave, how to mend tools, how to read the signs of weather. Education was not from books, but from watching, practicing, and listening. Games still had a place. Children played with carved wooden toys, stones, or simple games in the snow. Their laughter was a bright sound against the silence of winter fields. Meals and cooking meals were small and stretched carefully. Soups and stews were the most common, made with root vegetables, grains, and a little salted meat when available. Bread, coarse and heavy, appeared at nearly every meal. On special days, dried fruits, nuts, or a small piece of cheese added variety. Cooking took place over the hearth fire. Iron pots hung from hooks, and bread was sometimes baked on flat stones or in simple clay ovens. The smell of boiling broth, or roasting meat, rare as it was, brought comfort to a household where food was both precious and fragile. The long nights, winter nights, were especially long. With the sun setting early, families might spend half the day in darkness. Candles and oil lamps gave only dim light, so most activities slowed after sunset. People gathered around the fire to talk, sing, or tell stories. Folktales, legends, and family history were passed from one generation to the next in these hours. For children, these stories shaped their sense of the world. For adults, they were a reminder of heritage and resilience. Prayer and devotion were also common. Families gave thanks for what they had and asked for strength to endure. Winter was a season of uncertainty, and faith gave hope when supplies grew thin. Illness and care cold. Damp cottages often bred illness. Coughs, fevers, and joint pains were common, especially among the elderly and very young. Without modern medicine, care came in the form of herbal remedies, rest by the fire, and the gentle work of family members tending to the sick. Some families relied on knowledge passed down through generations, herbs like sage for sore throats, garlic for fevers, or honey for wounds. While not always effective, these remedies offered comfort and the sense of doing something against illness. The emotional weight of winter, perhaps. The greatest challenge was not physical, but emotional. The endless cold, the hunger, the long nights sit, wore on people's spirits. Families fought not only to preserve their food and their health, but also their hope. This is why community mattered so much. A shared story, a neighbor's gift of bread, or a gathering at the church could lift heavy hearts. These moments reminded people that winter was not forever, that spring would return. Marking time, winter might have felt endless, but people marked time with small rituals and festivals. Christmas brought joy with church services, feasts, and the promise of light in darkness. Candlemas in early February marked the turning point when the days began to grow longer. Each event broke the monotony and gave people something to look forward to. Waiting for spring every day of winter was a step towards spring. Families counted their food, measured their fuel, and prayed for endurance. By late winter, the supplies often grew dangerously low. Meals became thinner, bread stretched with less grain, and hunger more pressing. This was the hardest part of all the hungry gap before new crops could grow. Yet still, people carried on. They worked, they shared, and they hoped. Daily life in winter was not grand or heroic. It was steady, ordinary, and full of quiet strength. It was about waking up each morning, tending the fire, feeding the animals, and making it through another day. As the winter days dragged on, food grew scarcer and hunger sharper. In the next section, we will step into the harshest part of the season, when supplies ran out, famine threatened, and survival became a battle against starvation itself. The threat of starvation for medieval farmers. Winter was always difficult, but in some years it became deadly. A poor harvest, spoiled food, or an early frost could turn the season from hardship into famine. When supplies ran low and barns stood nearly empty, families faced the most terrifying reality of all: starvation. Survival depended on careful planning, but even the most careful family was at the mercy of nature. A summer of heavy rains could rot grain in the fields. A dry season could shrivel crops before they matured. Disease among animals could wipe out herds, leaving families without milk, cheese, or meat. In years of plenty, food was stored for lean times, but many peasants lived so close to the edge that there was little extra to keep. A single failed harvest might mean that winter was entered with already empty stores, the hungry gap even in normal years. Peasants dreaded what they called the hungry gap. This was the period in late winter and early spring when the stored grain from the past harvest was nearly gone, but the new crops had not yet grown. By March or April, bread was thinner and harder. Families mixed what little flour they had with barley, oats, or even crushed acorns and chestnuts. Soups became weaker, stretched with water. Children often ate last, or their portions were cut smaller. Every day was a careful balancing act between what remained and how many mouths needed feeding. Wild foods and foraging. When stores ran out, people turned to the land around them. Foraging became a last defense against starvation. Nuts and seeds, acorns, chestnuts, and hazelnuts were gathered and ground into flour or roasted. Roots and herbs, wild garlic, nettles, and dandelion leaves were boiled into broths, bark and husks in extreme cases. People mixed ground bark or husks into bread dough, producing loaves that filled the stomach but gave little nutrition. These foods kept people alive, but they were no substitute for a full diet. Weakness and illness followed, especially in children. Famine years in history. Across medieval Europe, there were years remembered for their hunger. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 struck much of northern Europe after years of heavy rains ruined. Crops, grain rotted in the fields, hay could not be dried, and livestock starved. Reports tell of people reduced to eating whatever they could find: roots, grass, even animals not normally considered food. In some regions, whole villages were abandoned as people fled in search of better supplies. Many did not survive the journey. It was a reminder that famine was never far away, even for communities that worked hard and planned carefully. The toll of starvation. Starvation did not always come quickly. It arrived slowly, in thinning bodies, pale faces, and tired limbs. At first, meals grew smaller. Then, people skipped meals altogether. Parents often gave food to children first, sacrificing their own health. The elderly sometimes stepped back willingly, choosing hunger so that younger generations could survive. With less food came weakness. Chores took longer, fields were left untended, and animals sometimes went without care. Illness followed hunger, as bodies grew too frail to fight off disease. Winter coughs turned to deadly fevers. Small wounds became infected. Desperation and hard choices, hunger could lead to choices no one wished to make. Families sometimes sold or traded their last animals, knowing they would lose milk or eggs, but hoping to gain a sack of grain. Tools might be pawned, leaving farmers unable to plow when spring returned. In the worst cases, theft and violence broke out, with hungry people raiding barns or robbing travelers. These acts were born not from greed, but from desperation. In the face of starvation, survival overpowered every other rule. The role of the church and lords during times of famine. People turned to those who had more. The church was often expected to distribute food from monasteries and storehouses. Lords, too, might release grain to their tenants, though often at a price or as a loan that had to be repaid later. Charity could save lives, but it was never guaranteed. Some lords were generous, others were harsh. The poorest often suffered, the most with little recourse but prayer and endurance. The emotional weight of hunger beyond the physical toll. Starvation carried heavy emotional burdens. Parents listened to the cries of hungry children, knowing they could do little. Families watched supplies shrink day by day, the cupboard growing emptier, the cellar bare. In these moments, faith and community became crucial. Villagers leaned on one another for comfort, even if they had little food to share. Churches filled with prayers for deliverance, and festivals, though small, became vital sparks of hope in the darkness. Survival through adaptation, despite the horrors of famine, people found ways to endure. They adapted diets, stretched supplies, and created new methods of preservation when possible. Some regions learned to diversify crops, planting oats or rye alongside wheat to guard against total failure. Communities also developed systems of shared storage, ensuring that at least some food could be distributed in times of need. Over time, these practices formed a kind of resilience. Famine never disappeared, but farmers grew wise in their methods of preparing for and responding to it. Starvation as a teacher, while famine brought immense suffering. It also shaped medieval society. It taught communities the value of cooperation, of planning, and of humility before nature. It reminded people that survival was fragile and that life was sustained not only by labor, but by hope, kindness, and endurance. The threat of starvation hung over every medieval winter. Yet in the face of hunger and fear, people clung to something beyond food, their faith, their traditions, and their rituals of hope. In the next section, we turn to the spiritual and cultural side of winter survival. Prayers, festivals, and beliefs gave people strength when their bodies were weak. Faith, rituals, and hope. The hunger and cold pressed heavily on medieval farmers during winter. But survival was not measured only by food and fuel. Strength also came from the mind and spirit. Faith, rituals, and traditions gave people hope. When supplies ran low and nights stretched endlessly, in a world where little could be controlled, belief in God and the cycle of the seasons offered comfort and meaning. The central role of faith religion touched every part of life in the Middle Ages, and winter was no exception. The Church taught that suffering had purpose, that hardship in this life could bring reward in the next. For peasants facing hunger, these teachings gave dignity to their struggle. Prayers filled homes and churches. Families prayed before meals. Even when the meal was thin soup or hard bread, they asked God to bless their food, to stretch what remained, and to bring the spring quickly. For many, prayer was a way of sharing burdens, of placing fears into the hands of something greater. Church festivals in winter. The church calendar provided a rhythm that helped break the monotony of the long season. Festivals marked moments of light in the darkness, reminding people that joy and community still had a place even in the hardest months. Christmas celebrated the birth of Christ with church services, carols, and shared meals. Even the poorest households tried to set aside something special, a bit of meat, a piece of cheese, or a sweetened bread. The holiday was a reminder of hope and renewal. Epiphany in early January marked the visit of the Magi and often brought more small celebrations. Candlemas, held in early February, was especially important. Families brought candles to church to be blessed, a symbol of light returning as the days slowly grew longer. It reminded everyone that winter would not last forever. These festivals offered more than spiritual comfort. They were also moments of gathering where villagers shared warmth, food, and laughter. Even in scarcity, people found ways to celebrate together. Superstitions and folk rituals alongside church rituals. Farmers also held two folk traditions that gave them a sense of control over nature's hardships. Some lit fires or candles at specific times, believing the light would protect homes from evil during long nights. Others hung herbs or charms to ward off sickness or misfortune. Stories and folklore filled the winter evenings. Tales of saints, spirits, and ancient heroes were told around the hearth. These stories were not only entertainment, they carried moral lessons and reminded listeners that others had endured trials before them. Hope in the return of spring, perhaps the most powerful ritual of all, was simply the act of waiting together. Farmers marked the gradual lengthening of days after the winter solstice. Each extra minute of daylight was a sign that the earth was slowly turning back toward warmth and growth. By late February or early March, even the smallest signs of spring snowdrops blooming, birds returning, the ground softening were celebrated with joy. These moments were woven into prayers and stories, turning natural changes into symbols of hope. Community worship, church services brought villagers together, not only to worship, but to support one another. In the dim light of a chapel or church, surrounded by neighbors, people felt part of something larger than their own hunger or hardship. Singing hymns together, sharing in holy days, and receiving blessings created a sense of unity for those who felt weakest. These moments reminded them they were not alone. The whole community stood side by side, enduring winter as one body of faith. Faith as strength in famine during famine years. When starvation loomed, faith became even more important. Sermons encouraged patience, charity, and trust in divine providence. Though this did not fill empty stomachs, it gave meaning to suffering and a reason to continue. Many also believed that charity itself was a path to salvation. Sharing bread with a neighbor or giving a portion of grain to the poor was not only kindness but also an offering to God. These acts strengthened bonds within the village, and spread hope through generosity. The inner warmth of belief, it is easy to see winter in purely physical terms: cold winds, empty barns, thin bodies. But for medieval farmers, survival was also about the warmth of the spirit. Faith and ritual gave people a light in the darkness. They gave shape to suffering, turning it from meaningless hardship into part of a divine story. Hope, whether in the form of prayer, a blessed candle, or the promise of spring, was as necessary as bread or fire. It kept families steady when despair might have broken them. Faith gave medieval farmers strength, but not all people endured winter in the same way. The life of a poor peasant was very different from that of a wealthy lord. In the next section, we will explore these contrasts, how lords and peasants faced the same season with vastly different resources, and how those differences shaped their experiences of winter survival. Differences between peasants and lords. Winter touched every soul in the medieval world. But it did not touch all people equally. The season's hardships weighed heaviest on peasants, who lived close to the edge of survival. Lords and nobles also faced the cold and the dark, yet their resources made the experience very different. To understand the full picture of medieval winter survival, we must look at both ends of society, how peasants and lords endured, and how their lives intersected. In those long, frozen months, the peasants' struggle for peasants. Winter was a season of constant caution. Their food was limited, their cottages draughty, and their clothing worn from years of use. Every loaf of bread, every log of wood, every bundle of hay was counted and measured. A mistake in rationing could mean hunger before spring. Meals were plain and repetitive. Bread, porridge, thin soup, and perhaps some salted meat formed the diet. When food stores shrank, substitutes were added: oats stretched into wheat bread, or roots boiled into broth. The poorest peasants sometimes faced outright starvation, relying on charity or desperate foraging. Warmth was equally precarious. Small fires fueled by wood or peat gave minimal heat, and families gathered close together to share what warmth they could. Clothing, though practical, was often patched and thin. A single harsh winter could weaken even the strongest household. The lord's advantage, by contrast, lords and wealthy landowners lived in far greater comfort. Their manors or castles had larger fires, better insulation, and greater stores of food. Servants maintained fires day and night, ensuring warmth in living quarters. Tapestries, rugs, and heavy curtains helped to block drafts and make rooms feel less bare. Their tables displayed far more variety. While peasants survived on bread and pottage, lords enjoyed meat, fish, spiced dishes, honey, and imported goods like dried fruits and almonds. Feasts broke up the monotony of winter, and wine, ale, and cider flowed more freely. Starvation was unlikely for the wealthy, though shortages might limit their luxuries. Even clothing revealed the difference. Nobles wore layers of fine wool, fur, and linen tailored to fit, while peasants wrapped themselves in whatever was available. Lords displayed garments as symbols of wealth as well as sources of warmth, dependence, and obligation. Despite these contrasts, peasants and lords were bound together. Peasants farmed the land that fed their lords. Silence that made villagers drop their eyes. They asked questions that were not questions. How long had the raven been with the girl? What had fair weather done to cleanse her? Did anyone remember signs from her infancy and natural dreams? Strange marks, voices carried on wind. The villagers, eager to please, eager not to be noticed. answered with half-truths and whispers that sounded braver when repeated in candlelight. Mattie felt the change before she was told. Eyes lingered longer, shutters closed earlier. A man who once sold her apples muttered that he had none left, though the stall behind him said otherwise. Children no longer dared her street at all. Their parents held them tight when she passed, as though the raven might pluck them away, and yet none of it reached her as sharply as her mother's silence. The woman spoke less and less, as though words themselves might betray her. Fairweather, caught between ruin and salvation, saw his chance. He humbled himself before the riders, pleaded for the authority to conduct a second rite one sanctioned, one under their gaze. If he could succeed with their blessing, perhaps the stain of failure might wash away. Perhaps the whispers of incompetence would cease. The riders did not promise. They only watched, measured, and reported. The raven, oblivious to politics, grew restless. He spent hours circling the steeple, cawing until Fairweather stumbled from his study to shout at him, voice cracking, arms flailing. Mattie laughed once at the sight, the sound carrying across the square like a bell. It turned heads, it spread unease. The priest clenched his fists and swore under his breath that the girl had to be broken before she broke him completely. At night, the air shifted. Mattie felt it in her bones, the way the village held its breath, waiting. The riders lit no fires in their lodgings, but their shadows moved behind curtains. The raven perched on her bedpost, staring at the window as though expecting someone or something to arrive. She whispered to him, but he did not answer this time. He only cocked his head, feathers bristling, listening to what she could not hear. And then came the letter, a parchment sealed in red, delivered into Fairweather's trembling hands. The cardinal's words were brief, brutal. The girl would be tested again. If she withstood, she would be named witch, and the church would take her. If she faltered, if the ritual held, she would be purified, and her soul saved. Either way, the matter would be ended. The decision would not rest in the village any longer. Fairweather, read it aloud in the square, voice cracking on every second word. The villagers shifted uneasily, but none spoke against it. They were tired of being caught between terror and silence. A resolution, even one soaked in dread, was still a resolution. Mattie listened. The raven tight against her arm, his claws pricking her sleeve. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. She only breathed in, slow and steady, as though she had been waiting for this all along. The storm had not left her. It had only been circling back. We'll pause here, with the cardinal's decree settling like iron over the village, and Mattie standing at the edge of a second trial, one that will not end quietly. The square had been swept clean by dawn. The riders oversaw it, their boots tracking mud across the cobbles as they arranged the space like a stage. Benches were pulled forward, ropes strung to mark boundaries, candles placed in a circle that flickered with uneasy light even in the morning sun. Villagers gathered slowly, pulled by the gravity of spectacle, whispering behind hands. Children clung to skirts, their wide eyes darting to the raven perched atop the church steeple, feathers gleaming dark as oil dart. Father Fairweather stood at the center, gaunt and trembling, clutching the cardinal's letter as though it were both shield and noose. His voice rasped when he announced the rite, this time. Sanctioned, watched, judged by men who carried the weight of Rome itself. His gaze flicked toward the riders at every pause, searching for their approval. They gave none. Their faces were as cold and smooth as carved stone. Mattie was led forward, her mother at her side. The woman's face was hollowed with fear, but She said nothing, only pressed her hand to her daughter's shoulder until she was made to step back. Mattie moved without protest, her chin high, the raven swooping down to settle on her arm as though summoned. A hiss rose from the crowd, half fear, half awe. None dared cross the rope. The rite began. Candles guttered, though there was no wind. Fairweather's voice cracked as he recited the prayers, his Latin slipping into stammers. He sprinkled salt, drew chalk symbols that smudged under his shaking hands. The riders watched every motion, their expressions unreadable. The villagers leaned forward, straining for some sign, some omen, ready to claim it as truth. The raven grew restless. He shifted from foot to foot, wings twitching, eyes glinting like coals. When Fairweather raised the crucifix, the bird let out a single, sharp cry that split the air like glass. Mattie did not flinch. She only stared at the priest, her lips pressed into a thin line. The sound rolled through the square, and for a moment, even the candles seemed to shrink from it. Fairweather pressed on, desperate. He placed the crucifix against Mattie's forehead, muttering faster, louder. Nothing, no scream, no convulsion, no sign of torment. Only her stillness and the raven's steady cawing, echoing back fragments of his words in a voice too human. The crowd shuddered. Mothers pulled children close. The riders exchanged a glance, sharp and fleeting dot. Then the air shifted. A wind stirred that did not touch the banners or the trees, but only the circle itself. The candles bent toward Mattie, flames stretching as though drawn to her. She did not move. The raven flared his wings, and with a snap of his beak, every flame guttered out. Smoke curled upward, black and heavy, clinging to the air long after it should have dispersed. Silence fell. Fairweather dropped the crucifix. His hand shook too violently to pick it up again. He fell to his knees, gasping, words spilling from him in broken fragments. Devil, corruption, curse. But his cries sounded thin, small against the weight of what everyone had just seen. The riders stepped forward at last. One stooped, lifted the crucifix, brushed the soot from it. He turned to the crowd, his voice even sharp enough to cut the silence. She is marked. Whether by heaven or hell remains to be seen. The cardinal will decide. Gasps rippled through the villagers. Fairweather slumped, his mouth working wordlessly, stripped of authority. Mattie stood motionless, the raven perched like a crown upon her arm, feathers sleek with shadow. She felt the eyes of the crowd on her, not pity now, not hatred alone, but something deeper, something that would linger long after the riders had gone. We'll pause here, with the second trial ended not in cleansing, but in uncertainty, and the cardinal himself called upon to pass judgment. Days passed with the weight of anticipation pressing down on the village like the thick air before a storm. Mattie remained mostly inside, the raven ever at her side, watching from windows and rafters, wings folded but eyes alert. The villagers, equally watchful, whispered behind drawn curtains, stepping aside when they saw her on the streets. The market felt emptier, quieter. Even the wind seemed hesitant, holding its breath as though waiting for some signal to move again. Fairweather, cowered in his study, shuffling papers, muttering prayers. His faith, once rigid and unquestioned, had become brittle. Each time he dared glance out a window, he expected to see the raven tearing at someone, the girl casting some spell he could not name, a hand raised in defiance. His authority was gone, replaced by fear that would follow him until his last days. The cardinal's arrival was unannounced, as far as the villagers could tell. No banners, no heralds, only a shadow passing the gates with men in black. Riding behind, their boots thudding against the soaked cobbles. He was not a figure of spectacle, but of inevitability. When the messenger delivered the word that the cardinal himself would attend, the town sank into a hush, a tense expectancy that clung to walls and chimneys. Mattie sensed it before she heard the hoofbeats. Even the raven stiffened, feathers bristling, wings twitching as if reading the wind better than any human could. She had grown accustomed to the attention, but the cardinal's presence was different. He carried a weight that pressed into the chest, a certainty that could crush hesitation. And yet, she did not hide. She stood by her broken window, the rain glinting off glass and roof tiles. The raven perched tall, sharp-edged and ready. Her mother was near, hands pressed to her mouth, silent for once. She could do nothing now, only watch. The villagers peered from behind shutters, from doorways, some clutching rosaries, others crossing themselves again and again. And Fairweather poor, shattered Fairweather, had no words left to plead. Only a trembling gesture toward the girl, as though offering her as a shield, or perhaps seeking one himself. The cardinal rode into the square slowly, boots splashing. Through mud, cloak hanging heavy and wet eyes, like a pair of unyielding stones. His men flanked him, silent as shadows, every movement deliberate. The wind seemed to shift around him, carrying the scent of rain, smoke, and a hint of iron. He dismounted without ceremony, his gaze sweeping the gathered crowd, pausing only on Mattie and on the raven at her side. Mattie stood still, letting the silence stretch. The cardinal approached, slow and measured, and finally spoke. His voice was low, precise, resonant enough to reach the edges of the square. "Matilda Fairweather," he said, pausing as though testing the weight of the words on the air. "Have heard tales, I have seen reports, and now I come to see for myself." The raven cawed, short and sharp. Mattie's lips curved in the smallest hint of a smile. The storm in her chest tightened, sharpened. This was not a threat yet, not quite, but it was an assessment. The cardinal was measuring her, the bird, and perhaps the entire village along. With them, Fairweather sank further into the shadows of his own authority, murmuring under his breath, trying to find any words that might save him, save the girl, or save his place. His mother stood behind her, silent and frail, unsure whether to shield or release. And Mattie, calm, resolved, met the cardinal's gaze directly, feeling the full force of judgment, yet refusing to break under it. We'll pause here, on the edge of confrontation, with the cardinal's attention fully upon Mattie and the village, holding its breath for the next move, the next word, the next flick of a raven's wing. The cardinal stepped forward, every footfall deliberate, his gaze fixed on Mattie and the raven perched lightly on her arm. He spoke with measured authority, questioning her about the bird, the failed rituals, and the tales of strange happenings that had reached him. Mattie responded with quiet composure, offering no words of defiance, only a still certainty that spoke louder than any protest. Occasionally, the raven interjected with a sharp caw or a deliberate tilt of its head, as if translating her silent resolve. The cardinal searched for deception, for signs of possession, or any hint of vulnerability, but he found none. Time stretched, the tension palpable. The villagers watched from behind their doors and shutters. Mothers clutched children, and Father Fairweather trembled at the edges of the square. Her mother's hands were pressed together, knuckles white, eyes wide with anxiety and hope. But Mattie remained steady, a calm anchor at the center of a storm that had not yet fully cleared. The cardinal's men shifted uneasily, unused to a presence so quietly impervious. Hours passed, yet the girl did not falter. At last, the cardinal gave a subtle gesture to his men to lower their weapons, to step back. He did not speak approval, but he did not issue punishment either. In that deliberate silence, there was acknowledgement. Some forces, some lives, could not be governed by ceremony, authority, or fear alone. Outside, the storm had softened into a gentle drizzle, silver threads dancing in the dim moonlight. Mattie opened her window fully, letting the cool night breeze wash over her. The raven took flight for a moment, circling once above the rooftops before returning to settle on her shoulder. Its feathers glimmered with the faint reflection of the moon. And Mattie smiled softly, a gesture private yet resolute. Her mother exhaled finally, relief flooding her face. Father Fairweather retreated quietly, shaken, perhaps understanding, at last, that some matters were beyond his reach. The cardinal departed with his men, leaving the village with whispered stories, questions unanswered, and a sense that something extraordinary had taken place. Mattie remained by her window, the raven coiled protectively against her, the night pressing gently around them. The village would speak of her for years, some in fear, some in awe, but she knew the truth. She had endured, she had chosen, and she had found a companion in the darkness. Together they faced the night, untethered, unafraid, with the world beyond theirs to navigate as it would. And now, dear listener, it's time to dim the lights and let the story drift away. Mattie sleeps, the raven rests, and the night folds softly around them. Good night. We'll wait here together, ready for the next story when it comes.